December 21st, 1944, 6:17 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow clung to every branch, thick and silent, muffling the sounds of the waking forest. The ground was frozen solid, cracked like old porcelain under the weight of boots and treads. The air smelled of pine and gunpowder, a bitter combination that made your throat tighten. Fog crawled along the valleys, swallowing trenches and foxholes in gray haze. You could almost hear it breathing. Somewhere down the winding forest road, an M4 Sherman lay on its side, tracks bent and twisted, turret facing the sky like a giant fallen insect. Its steel carcass had been knocked out by German 75mm fire the previous evening. Smoke had curled into the air before freezing into icicles along the barrel. To the Germans, it was dead, done. No one would see this tank again, but the Americans had a different idea. Inside a nearby makeshift field repair station, Corporal James "Jimmy" O'Connell rubbed his hands raw, the tips turning bright red against the biting cold. He crouched over a half-dismantled transmission, grease frozen stiff under his fingers. Around him, other mechanics, Lieutenant Robert Jenkins, Sergeant Paul Hensley, worked with surgical precision. Sparks flew from torches as metal met metal. Every bolt, every gear, was a pulse in the lifeblood of the Sherman. Outside, the forest lay. Quiet, unaware of the miracle unfolding. "We can have her rolling again before noon," O'Connell muttered, voice low, almost to himself. He glanced at the Sherman, tilted like a monument to destruction. Watch and learn, boys. You could feel the tension before you even saw the Germans. Across the ridges, elements of Panzer Lehr Division crouched in frozen foxholes. Feldwebel Karl. Brandt and his men had been tracking the American advance for days. They had witnessed M4s explode, Sherman after Sherman twisted metal, and black smoke rising like grim flags across the snow. The Germans believed these tanks were gone, finished, dead, and yet, through the mist, movement began. It started small. Shovel here, a wrench there. Then steel groaned under brute human strength as the damaged Sherman's engine roared to life. A cloud of white exhaust puffed into the air, curling like ghostly fingers above the snow line. The German observers blinked, then rubbed their eyes. Impossible. The Sherman was moving, slowly at first, awkwardly, like a wounded animal testing its legs, but then smooth, balanced, alive. The tank that should have been a heap of ice and steel was rolling down the forest track again, turret swiveling as if it had never been hit. Inside, O'Connell's grin was wide enough to split his frozen cheeks. "Time to teach them a lesson," he whispered. Out in the forest, Brandt's men froze, their binoculars fogged, fingers numbed by frost. They had expected bodies, silence, wreckage. Instead, they were watching what looked like a resurrection. A Sherman, previously destroyed, was now barreling toward the enemy lines as if mocking fate itself. And then came the sound different from snow crunching or branches snapping. It was the Sherman's engine, steady and confident, a low growl that seemed to fill the forest. German artillery crews behind the ridge tensed. They had rounds ready for tanks they believed were gone forever. But targeting a moving, repaired machine that had already defied death? Confusing, disorienting, terrifying. Inside the Sherman, Hensley leaned over the control panel, checking gauges and valves. "She's holding," he said, voice steady, but adrenaline sharp. "Let's make this count." The men exchanged nods, silent communication honed by weeks of fire, frost, and fear. As the Sherman disappeared into the mist toward the German positions, the Panzer crews realized something critical. This was not just a tank coming back. It was a message, a demonstration of American ingenuity and relentless persistence. Every bolt tightened in the frozen field, every gear replaced under impossible conditions, was proof that destruction wasn't permanent. That war machines could be reborn. Brandt's mind raced. If one Sherman could return, what about the others? How many more of the dead tanks were still out there, waiting to rise again? And, more importantly, how could his carefully laid plans account for such miracles? The Ardennes, once quiet and foreboding under snow and fog, now seemed alive with threat. The Germans could hear the hum of engines beyond the trees. They could see silhouettes moving through mist. And somewhere deep inside, a seed of disbelief had been planted. In that moment, a new kind of tension gripped the Foresta battle, not just of firepower, but of perception. The Americans understood their tanks could be destroyed and rebuilt. The Germans had never considered such persistence. This was a turning point before bullets were even fired, and as the repaired Sherman crested the ridge, sunlight glinting off its polished steel, the field repair crew knew something the enemy did not. The forest had just witnessed a small miracle of war, but would it be enough to stop what was coming? The morning fog clung to the ridges like a shroud, muffling sound, twisting shapes into shadows. You could barely make out the frozen silhouettes of trees, yet movement betrayed life metallic, deliberate, unstoppable. The Sherman, once written off as a corpse, rolled steadily down the narrow Ardennes track, its treads crushing snow and ice, sending white shards into the air. Feldwebel Karl Brandt squinted through his binoculars, knuckles white around the cold leather. He had seen plenty of destruction in his years, the Blitzkrieg, the Russian winter, the endless grind of Europe, but nothing like this. This tank, dead yesterday, was alive today. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't luck. It was deliberate. Are we seeing this? Whispered Unteroffizier Heinrich Meyer, his breath clouding in the icy air. It's moving. Brandt didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced through calculations, probabilities, contingencies, but there were none. Every German officer, from the colonel down to the lowliest enlisted man, had assumed that once a Sherman was knocked out, it was gone forever. That assumption had shaped their strategy for months. And now it was shattered. Beyond the trees, more silhouettes emerged. Sherman after Sherman damaged yesterday, patched together under frostbitten hands, engines growling back to life. Smoke curled in pale spirals from patched exhausts, turrets swiveled, guns aligning with eerie precision. The Americans had turned field garages into resurrection chambers. Corpses of tanks became soldiers again. Brandt felt a chill knot from the winter, but from realization. They weren't just facing tanks. They were facing a force that refused death, a force that could take destruction and make it a weapon against them. Every Panzer crew had trained for the normal patterns of war: ambush, kill, move on. They had never accounted for revival. "Tell the artillery," Brandt barked. "Target them while they're exposed." But even as the commands were shouted, confusion spread. The Shermans weren't moving like frightened prey. They were coordinated. One would tilt slightly to the left, another covered the flank. A third surged ahead, smoke from its repaired engine forming a phantom cloud over the snow. The Americans weren't simply surviving, they were maneuvering. Inside the lead Sherman, Sergeant Paul Hensley adjusted the controls, scanning for German positions. "There they are," he muttered, spotting muzzle flashes far off the ridge. But instead of fear, there was a strange exhilaration. They were walking ghosts in the forest, dead yesterday, alive today, about to change everything. O'Connell leaned over, checking his gauges again. "They think they can stop us," he said quietly. "Let's give them a different kind of surprise." From the ridge, the Germans opened fire. Shells screamed across the snow, exploding into sprays of white. Yet the Shermans pressed forward, some armor dented, some tracks chipped, but engines humming with stubborn defiance. One tank rolled over a fallen tree, metal groaning but holding, the crew inside barely flinching. The Americans weren't just surviving the attack, they were absorbing it. Meyer's face turned pale as another Sherman emerged from the fog, its gun-trained and ready. It shouldn't be able to do that. Not again. Not all of them. Brandt slammed the butt of his rifle against his knee. It's not one tank, it's an army of them. The forest echoed with the grinding of treads, the hum of engines, and the faint whistle of winter wind. And somewhere in that chaos, the Germans realized the terrifying truth. These were not machines, they were statements. Statements of resilience, ingenuity, and sheer audacity. Each Sherman restored in the freezing fields of Belgium was a message, delivered straight into their hearts. In the distance, the battle lines began to shift. The Germans tried to regroup, tried to calculate how many of the dead tanks could possibly return, but every calculation fell short. Every estimate was meaningless. The Americans were rewriting the rules of engagement on the fly, turning mechanical corpses into living weapons. And then came the first real shock. A Sherman that had been hit the previous night, turret riddled with holes, smoke curling from its engine compartment, rolled forward as if mocking death itself. It fired, and the Germans realized the bullets weren't just a threat, they were a message. Somewhere in the chaos, Brant whispered to no one in particular, voice shaking, We didn't expect this. Not from them. Not here. The Ardennes Forest, cold and silent just hours ago, was alive with movement. Tanks that should have been gone now prowled the snowy roads, engines growling, turrets swiveling, crews alive and resolute. The Germans had faced many surprises in the war, but nothing like this. Not the Blitz, not Kursk, not even the Russian winter. This was different. This was impossible. And it was happening right before their eyes. And in the field repair station, O'Connell and his men worked quietly, already preparing the next batch of Shermans for resurrection. For the Americans, this was routine. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. As the first volleys shattered the frozen silence, one thought raced through Brant's mind. If one tank could come back from the dead, what else had been counted out and was about to return? December 21st, 1944, 8:32 a.m., Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the forest eerily still. A low gray sun struggled to pierce the fog, casting long, jagged shadows across the frozen road. Every branch sagged under ice, every footprint frozen mid-step, yet beneath this quiet, engines hummed with life. The Sherman sons wrecked, abandoned, written off we're moving again, like steel phantoms returned from death. Sergeant Paul Hensley gripped the steering wheel of his tank, eyes scanning the tree line. Eyes open, he muttered, voice taut with anticipation. They're not expecting this. Behind him, Corporal Jimmy O'Connell crouched over the gun's control panel, adjusting the sight with the precision of a surgeon. Sparks of frost drifted past. The periscope glinting in the weak sunlight. From the ridge above, Feldwebel, Karl Brandt, and his Panzer crews could barely believe their eyes. Smoke curls from destroyed tanks had long faded from memory, replaced by the impossible sight of their supposed victims advancing. Each Sherman, scarred by artillery and fire, rolled forward as if mocking the very laws of war. Brandt felt these. Ice in his chest tighten. They were not just coming, they were coming back alive. Fire! Shouted Unteroffizier Heinrich Meyer, fumbling with his binoculars. German 75mm and 88mm artillery opened up, rounds screaming through the cold air. Explosions churned snow into clouds of white, sending branches and debris tumbling. But the Shermans pressed on. One tank, its turret riddled with holes, heaved over a fallen oak, steel groaning but uncompromising. Another took a near-direct hit in the engine compartment, but its mechanics had already replaced critical parts, and it surged forward again. Inside the lead Sherman, Hensley felt every shudder of the hull, every thrum of the engine. They think they can stop us, he said quietly. Let's show them otherwise. The gunner, Private First Class Edward Eddie Martinez, swung the turret, targeting a German machine gun nest. With a deafening roar, the 75-meter cannon fired, knocking the position into splintered ruins. Smoke mixed with steam from frozen snow, creating a misty veil behind the tank as it moved. The Germans froze. Brandt could feel its hock, disbelief, panic. He had trained his men for months on conventional engagements, destroy the tank, move on. But every destroyed tank had returned. Every plan for annihilation had failed before it even began. He tried to shout orders, but the words stuck in his throat. The sheer audacity of the Americans' field repairs, the precision with which they returned to battle, had turned his confidence into chaos. Across the forest, more Shermans emerged from the fog. Each tank bore scars of previous engagements. Twisted armor, cracked tracks, scorched turrets. Yet each engine purred defiantly, each crew ready. They advanced with a purpose that was almost human. For the Germans, it was terrifying. They had seen the Sherman die before, over and over. Now death seemed irrelevant. The line between life and machine had blurred. O'Connell glanced at Hensley. One more ridge, then we push through their flank. Keep your head down. His hands were smeared with grease and ice, but there was a grin on his face. The field repair crews had given these tanks back their lives, and now the battlefield would witness their full fury. A burst of machine gun fire rattled across the lead tank's hull, shaking metal and freezing blood alike. Sparks flew where bullets Struck, but the tank didn't falter. Martinez swore under his breath, returning fire with lethal accuracy. The snow exploded around them in clouds of white, branches snapping under the blast. The Americans were no longer moving cautiously, they were hunting. From the German ridge, Brandt watched helplessly as a Sherman he thought destroyed the night before smashed through a defensive barricade, gun blazing. His men were scrambling, firing wildly, retreating into the forest. The Ardennes, once a frozen tomb of despair, had become a proving ground for American ingenuity. Brandt's heart sank. Every destroyed Sherman the Germans had counted as a victory had been resurrected. Every strategic assumption had been shattered. And yet, he realized something worse. This was only the beginning. The Americans had more tanks in the repair yards, more crews ready, and an unstoppable momentum building with each resurrected vehicle. A sharp cry from the ridge snapped Brandt's attention. Another Sherman appeared over the next ridge, silhouette. Outlined against the dim winter sun, its turret rotated methodically, gun leveled, engine thrumming like a heartbeat. Even from a distance it looked alive, a machine reborn, carrying the weight of defiance itself. Brandt gritted his teeth, eyes narrowing. If one can come back, how many more? The question hung over the battlefield like a specter. For the first time in months he felt true fear not for himself, but for the soldiers under his command. And somewhere in the frozen field O'Connell and his men prepared the next wave. Each bolt tightened, each track replaced, each engine tested. The war machine was relentless, tireless, impossible, and as the sun climbed higher, glinting off snow and steel, it became clear. The Germans were witnessing not just tanks returning to life, but a new kind of warfare, one where destruction no longer meant the end. The forest echoed with the grinding treads of Sherman after Sherman, the rattle of cannons, and the gasps of Panzer crews. The Germans had expected death, they had expected silence. Instead, they faced resurrection, and just over the next ridge, a glimmer of steel appeared, a Sherman they had written off the day before. Its turret swiveled slowly, deliberately, as if, scanning for Brandt himself, he swallowed hard. This was far from over. December 21st, 1944, 9:47 a.m. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The forest had transformed. What had been quiet, white and frozen now, vibrated with the growl of engines, the shattering of artillery, and the metallic scent of battle. Snowflakes mixed with smoke, drifting over the scene like ash. The repaired Shermans moved like predators, their treads cutting tracks through snow and debris, each tank a testament to American determination. Sergeant Hensley gripped the controls of his Sherman tightly, eyes flicking from periscope to compass, scanning the shadows of the trees. The forest was deceptive. Every ridge could conceal German artillery. Every hollow could hide an ambush. But for the first time in weeks, the Americans held the advantage, not just in firepower, but in unpredictability. The Germans could not anticipate what should have been destroyed. "Ready to roll?" Corporal Jimmy O'Connell asked quietly, leaning over the engine panel. His fingers traced over frost-covered gears, tightened bolts, and repaired wiring. Each movement was precise, a ritual perfected. Under cold, danger, and fire, this is our chance. From the ridge above, Feldwebel Karl Brandt barked orders, panic creeping into his voice. "Hold the line! Stop them here!" He slammed his fist on the icy rail of his observation post. But his men faltered. Every position they had prepared for the American advance was being overrun by tanks they had already counted dead. The first volleys rang out from repaired Shermans, tearing into machine gun nests and bunkers. Snow and splintered wood exploded into clouds of white and gray. Brandt ducked instinctively as bullets tore through the air, slicing branches, cracking ice, rattling his helmet. Every Sherman that fired seemed to roar, not just in power, but in defiance. Inside the lead tank, Private First Class Eddie Martinez lined up the next target, a German anti-tank gun partially hidden behind a ridge. The snow crunched beneath treads as he adjusted the sight. A deep breath, a click, and the 75mm cannon fired. The gun disintegrated in a burst of fire and metal. The forest echoed with the sound, an almost supernatural announcement. They were not done yet. The Germans scrambled, firing sporadically, retreating into the trees, but it was futile. For every tank they thought gone, another emerged, fully operational. The field repair crews had orchestrated a quiet miracle. Tanks restored from twisted metal, engines resurrected, armor reinforced. The Americans moved with the confidence of those who had already defied fate. Brandt's mind raced. Each Sherman that rolled into view was a living embodiment of his failure to anticipate the unexpected. The rigid calculations of the Wehrmacht timelines, attrition rates, kill counts were meaningless here. The Americans had rewritten the rules of survival, and then came the moment Brandt could not unsee. A Sherman that had been a wreck the night before climbed over a shattered barricade, turret spinning, guns blazing. Its crew had replaced the destroyed, transmission overnight, repaired the tracks, and restored the engine. Smoke puffed from the exhaust. Ice melted into slush beneath the tank, and yet it advanced as if born for battle that morning. "Impossible," Brandt muttered under his breath. "Every one of them?" His voice trailed off as he realized the full scale of what was happening. The Americans were not only surviving, they were overwhelming. Across the battlefield, the Shermans coordinated like a single organism. One tank drew fire from a hidden pillbox. Another moved to flank, hitting a secondary nest before it could respond. Hensley's Sherman roared forward, engines vibrating with power, guns cutting through the German lines. Snow, smoke, and steel collided in a blur. The tide was turning. O'Connell leaned back for a moment, wiping frost and sweat from his brow. "They're breaking," he said, "one ridge at a time." His voice carried the calm certainty of men who had built life from destruction. Around him, other crews mirrored the same quiet determination. Each tank restored was a statement, each advance a silent proclamation that ingenuity could beat brute force. Brandt watched helplessly as his defensive lines crumbled. Men ducked into the forest, artillery teams abandoned positions, and machine gun crews fell silent in awe and fear. The tanks they had destroyed, the positions they had believed safe, were now under relentless assault by resurrected machines. And then Hensley spotted movement behind the next Ridgemore Shermans, emerging from the fog like specters, engines growling. Turrets scanning. They had been repaired just hours earlier. The field repair crews had more tanks ready, and the Germans had no idea how many were coming. Brandt swallowed hard. The forest no longer belonged to him. The Germans had lost more. Than positions they had lost certainty, confidence, control. Each Sherman was a reminder that what they thought permanent could be undone, and what they believed dead could rise again. The sun climbed higher, catching the steel and ice in blinding flashes. Snow sprayed from treads, bullets ricocheted, and the smell of gunpowder mingled with pine. The Americans pressed forward, relentless, unyielding, alive. Brandt's jaw tightened. He could hear it before he saw it. The unmistakable roar of yet another Sherman engine, deep and steady, approaching over the ridge. His men turned their heads, eyes wide, hearts hammering. Another machine he had counted dead was coming, and this one was larger, newer, and moving faster than any he had seen this morning. For the first time, Brandt realized that the battle was no longer about numbers or strategy. It was about survival against an enemy that refused to stay defeated. And, as the Sherman crested the ridge, turret swiveling deliberately toward the ridge line, Brandt whispered, almost to himself, "How many more?" December 21st, 1944, 10:53 a.m. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The forest no longer resembled the quiet winter woodland it had been that morning. Smoke curled from shattered trees, snow churned into gray sludge, and the scent of gunpowder mixed with scorched steel hung in the freezing air. The sounds of engines low, steady, alive dominated the landscape. Shermans patched, welded, and revived, moved like relentless ghosts, cutting through the German lines with surgical precision. Sergeant Hensley crouched in his tank, eyes fixed on the ridge ahead. Through the periscope, He could see the German soldiers breaking formation, artillery crews abandoning their guns, and machine gun nests silent under the relentless approach of the resurrected Shermans. Each tank rolled forward with a determination that seemed almost human, as if it had learned the taste of survival and would not stop for anything. "Keep moving," Hensley muttered, voice tight with focus. "We're not letting them regroup." Corporal Jimmy O'Connell leaned over the engine panel, checking gauges one last time before the final push. The frost on his cheeks melted in patches, streaked with grease and soot. They thought they could write. "Us off," he said quietly. "Let's show them we don't stay down." On the ridge above, Feldwebel Karl Brandt could only watch in disbelief. His carefully prepared defensive positions were in shambles. Snow was trampled into mud where soldiers had fled. Machine gun nests lay in ruins. Explosions sent shards of ice and wood into the sky. Every German calculation, every plan had been undone by these tanks, these machines that should have been dead. "Hold the line! Form up!" Brandt shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the chaos. His men had lost cohesion. Every Sherman that appeared on the horizon was another impossible resurrection, another steel ghost coming to life. He had thought the Americans were vulnerable when their tanks fell. He had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. From the tree line, Martinez adjusted the 75mm cannon on Hensley's Sherman, targeting a German bunker that had pinned down one of their own men the night before. He fired. The explosion threw snow and timber into the air. Silence followed, broken only by the low growl of the approaching Shermans. Another bunker collapsed. Another ridge fell. The Germans were losing ground they had considered secure. Brandt's mind raced. Every tank he thought destroyed had returned to the fight. Every defensive assumption had failed. He realized with a chill that the Americans had not merely repaired. Machines, they had turned destruction into advantage, loss into weapon. The battlefield itself was bending to their will, and then he saw it. A Sherman, one that had been hit in the previous night's assault, climbing over the remains of a destroyed bridge. Ice clung to its tracks, turret dented, engine puffing smoke, but it moved. Alive, dominant. The crew inside had rebuilt it with hands raw and frozen, determination burning hotter than any fire. The German soldiers froze. Many dropped to the snow, staring at a machine they had counted dead. Some reached for their rifles, but their hands trembled. Every volley seemed meaningless against tanks that had already defied death. Brandt realized in that moment that survival in the Ardennes no longer depended on skill or strategy. It depended on facing what could not be anticipated. O'Connell's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. "Flank their right. Hensley, you take the lead. Martinez, support. Let's finish this." Each word carried the quiet confidence of men who had seen the impossible happen and were now executing it with ruthless precision. The Shermans advanced, one ridge after another, overwhelming what remained of the Panzer line. Snow exploded under. Tread's bullets ricocheted off steel, and the forest seemed to shudder under the weight of armored determination. Brandt's last reserves tried to mount a counterattack, but each attempt was crushed before it could form. He could feel the collapse, not just of positions or artillery, but of morale. His men were retreating, scattering, eyes wide with shock. The Ardennes, cold and silent at dawn, had become a proving ground for the impossible. Tanks that came back from the dead. Hensley's Sherman crested the final ridge of the sector, gun-trained on the retreating Germans. The smell of gunpowder, the spray of snow, the metallic hum of engineside, all combined into a moment of cinematic clarity. The battlefield had shifted. The line that Brandt had relied upon for weeks was gone. O'Connell allowed himself a rare smile. "They'll remember this," he muttered. "Every single one of them." Brandt watched as the last of his men fled into the trees, leaving artillery and machine guns behind. He felt the weight of failure settle over him like ice. The Americans had not only survived, they had turned every presumed loss into an unstoppable advantage. Every destroyed tank had returned stronger, faster, and more terrifying than before. And then, in the distance, another Sherman appeared, its tracks sliced through snow like a knife, its turret swiveled slowly, deliberately, scanning for targets. Brandt's breath caught. He had no idea how many more were coming, or how many had already been resurrected. But he knew one thing with certainty. The Ardennes would never be the same again. The forest echoed with the grinding treads of Sherman after Sherman, the roar of cannons and the whispers of men who had expected victory but found impossible defiance instead. Brandt's ridge, once secure, was now dominated by machines that refused to die. He sank to his knees, eyes locked on the advancing steel. This is unstoppable, he whispered, and somewhere behind him, O'Connell's crews were already preparing the next batch of Shermans for resurrection, ready to continue the assault. The battlefield had become a theater of miracles, and the Germans had no script to follow. December 21st, 1944, 2:17 p.m., Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The forest had fallen silent once more, not with peace but with the exhausted echo of survival. Snow lay churned and blackened with soot, splintered trees jutted, like jagged monuments to chaos. The smell of scorched metal, gunpowder, and frost-bitten earth lingered in the cold air. Only the low rumble of engines remained Shermans, repaired and battle-hardened, patrolling the remnants of a shattered German line. Sergeant Paul Hensley stepped down from his tank, boots crunching on ice and snow. He surveyed the battlefield, gray light glinting off twisted steel and mangled weapons. Around him, the Americans moved with quiet efficiency, checking vehicles, tending the wounded, and preparing the next wave of resurrected Shermans for deployment. Every repaired tank was more than armor, and treads it, was proof of ingenuity, resilience, and relentless determination. Corporal Jimmy O'Connell leaned against the hull of a Sherman, frost crusted in his hair. "They'll talk about this in the Reich," he said softly. "How tanks that should have been dead came back to fight again." He shook his head with a wry grin. "And they'll never know how we did it." Across the field, Feldwebel Karl Brandt stood among the few remaining German soldiers, frozen in disbelief. His defensive positions were annihilated, his men scattered, and his strategies undone by machines that had defied logic and expectation. He had seen war's brutality before, the Blitzkrieg, Kursk, Stalingrad, but this was different. A tank destroyed yesterday could return today. An army that was counted out could strike again. Brandt clenched his fists, realizing the full weight of what he had witnessed. Every calculation, every expectation of victory had been rendered meaningless by American mechanics, by the quiet brilliance of men who could resurrect what was lost. His mind raced through possibilities, but the truth was stark and undeniable. In the Ardennes, survival had become a new kind of warfare, one measured not by numbers or tactics, but by ingenuity and persistence. The soldiers of Panzer Lehr Division retreated into the forest, leaving behind artillery, machine guns, and shattered pride. And with every step the Germans fell back, the Americans pressed forward, Shermans prowling like silent sentinels over the snow. Hensley climbed back into his tank, Martinez at the gun, O'Connell at the engine panel, ready to continue the march. The war, they knew, was far from over, but for this day, victory belonged to persistence, ingenuity, and steel reborn. In the weeks that followed, the story of the resurrected Shermans would spread through the ranks. German intelligence reports catalogued tanks thought destroyed, only to see them return. Tales circulated of crews who rebuilt twisted hulks in hours, of engines brought back to life, of armor welded, reinforced, and sent back into battle. It became a symbol, a message that the American war machine was more than firepower. It was resourcefulness made flesh, determination welded to steel. For the Americans, it was a lesson in resilience. Every bolt tightened under frost, every engine repaired under snow, every tank brought back from the brink became part of a larger narrative. Nothing was permanent, and no defeat was final. The Ardennes would remember the day when destruction could be undone, when the impossible became possible, and when tanks dead yesterday returned to rewrite the battlefield. Brandt never forgot the image, the lead Sherman scarred and dented, cresting the ridge with its turret swiveling deliberately, guns ready, engines growling, moving like a creature that had cheated death. That image haunted him through the rest of the war, the reminder that sometimes victory depended not on force alone, but on the ability to rise again when all seemed lost. And in the quiet aftermath, as snow settled and smoke drifted lazily from the forests, O'Connell and Hensley prepared for the next wave. More Shermans lay waiting, more tanks that had been counted dead were ready to fight. Because in this war, and in this forest, destruction was never permanent. Steel could rise from the ashes, men could turn despair into power, and the battlefield could never again be taken for granted. The Ardennes had witnessed it firsthand, the impossible made real, the dead brought back to life, and the Germans left to reckon with what they had never imagined.